There is a classification in the conclave archive that has no assigned curator. Every other sealed record in the historical continuity division carries a name in the custodial field, a living historian, or the designation of a department, or at minimum the cold bureaucratic notation, assigned pending review. The custodial field exists because the conclave believes, as it has always believed, that knowledge must be held by someone. That is the first principle of the division. Nothing floats free. Every fact, every sealed account, every record of ruin and extinction and the quieter catastrophes that leave no bodies, all of it is anchored to a name, a shelf number, a physical location in the vaults, and a curator who will answer if asked. The classification I am describing has no curator. Its custodial field, when I first called it up on the reference terminal, was blank, not vacant, not deceased, reassigned pending. Not even the standard notation for records whose assigned historians have retired. Blank, as though the field had never been filled, as though the archive had always known, in whatever way an archive can know things, that no one would be staying. I did not think much of it at the time. I was not supposed to be looking at it at all. My name is Veth Sarun. I hold the rank of Senior Continuity Historian, 3rd tier, assigned to the Conclave Historical Continuity Division, Subchamber 12, which handles the reclassification and maintenance of what the division calls legacy sealed records, files older than 200,000 standard years, sealed by councils or authorities that no longer exist, whose classifications have never been formally reviewed, appealed, or lifted. There are more of these than most people realize. The conclave is old, and the conclave is bureaucratic. And old bureaucratic institutions accumulate sealed files the way a hull accumulates hull score. Slowly, without intention, and until one day someone notices the weight. I was brought in to reduce the weight. My mandate, issued 8 months ago by the division director, was narrow: conduct a systematic review of legacy sealed records in Subchamber 12's inventory, assess each for continued relevance, and issue reclassification recommendations. Upgrade, downgrade, archive permanent, or release. Routine work. The kind of work assigned to a historian of my rank and my age, which is to say a historian who has stopped being remarkable and started being reliable. I did not resent it. I had stopped resenting reliable work some years earlier, around the time I understood that remarkable careers in this division almost always ended in one of two ways: promotion to a level where you stop doing actual history, or a sealed record of your own. I had been working through the inventory in numerical sequence for 6 months before I reached the file that had no curator. Its inventory number was CCD SX12000001, the lowest possible inventory number in Subchamber 12. I had been working backward from the highest numbers: recent legacy seals, 300,000 years old, 400,000, 500,000, moving steadily through files whose contents were, for the most part, exactly as unremarkable as legacy files tend to be. Extinct civilizations, contamination zones, old territorial disputes between species that no longer existed in recognizable form, war records from conflicts whose victors had themselves been gone for 100,000 years. The kind of material that composes the vast majority of any deep archive. The sediment of time, the compressed evidence of everything that happened and stopped mattering. I had been working through it with a professional's efficiency, reducing the inventory methodically until I reached this one. The oldest record in the subchamber. Possibly the oldest sealed record in the entire division. I would later learn it was the third oldest in the whole archive, behind only 2 administrative foundation documents from the conclave's early formation that had been classified by accident and never reopened. The file's header showed classification date 912,000 standard years before present. Classifying authority, the Orath Covenant. Access restriction, maximum. Custodial field, blank. I knew the Orath by reputation. Every historian in the division does. They were, as far as any species in the current conclave can determine, the oldest sapient civilization in the accessible galaxy, older than the current conclave's founding by several 100,000 years, older than most of the elder species that now sit on the conclave's inner councils, older than the records of the records of the records of what came before. They were extinct. Had been extinct for approximately 12,000 standard years, by the best dating the division could produce from their physical remnants. They left behind ruins on 17 worlds, fragments of a written language that no one had fully decoded, and a small number of files in the conclave archive, 7, in total, that they had deposited over the course of their civilization's last 200,000 years. 6 of those 7 files were in active curation. They had been studied, cross-referenced, annotated, translated in part, and written about extensively. The Orath's contributions to conclave governance philosophy, their observations on stellar mechanics, their partial accounts of civilizations that had risen and fallen before the current conclave formed. All of it was known, to the extent that anything 900,000 years old can be known, to the scholars who worked with it. There was a whole subdepartment devoted to the Orath materials, staffed by 3 historians and a translation specialist, working out of Subchamber 7. I had met them at the division's annual review gathering. They were proud of their work. They spoke about the Orath with the particular combination of reverence and scholarly familiarity that comes from spending years with a subject that cannot answer back. The 7th file was CCD SX 12000001, and its custodial field was blank because, I would come to understand, every historian who had ever been assigned to it had eventually asked to be removed. I did not know that yet. I called up the header, noted the blank custodial field with mild professional curiosity, and submitted the standard access request for a preliminary review. The access request was approved automatically, which surprised me a little. Maximum access records usually require a senior administrator to confirm, a step that in my experience took between 2 and 5 working days. But the approval came back in seconds, as though the system had been waiting for the request, and I set the surprise aside, opened the file, and began to read. What follows is my account of what I found. I am setting it down in this form because I believe it should exist somewhere outside the official record. The official record, as I will explain, is no longer accurate. The outermost layer of the file was a standard Orath deposit receipt. The Orath filed things carefully. Their archival practices were, in the opinion of every scholar who had worked with their materials, more rigorous than the conclave's own. The deposit receipt identified the file as a covenant prohibition notice, a formal legal instrument, under Orath law, declaring a specific region of space off-limits to all covenant member species, and to all species bound by covenant treaty agreements. The region was designated in the receipt using an Orath coordinate system that took scholars 3 decades to map against modern stellar cartography. The translation had been done approximately 400 years ago and was appended as a note by a historian named Vel Korath, who had apparently opened the file, translated the coordinate header, appended the note, and then I checked the access log, never opened it again. The coordinate designation, mapped to modern cartography, corresponded to the region currently marked on conclave navigation charts as Sector Veth Null. Null designation. No entry. Do not approach. The most restrictive navigational classification in the current conclave's charting system. Sector Veth Null. I knew it the way every conclave historian knows it, the way every navigator, every fleet officer, every cartographer, every academy student who has ever studied the shape of the charted galaxy knows it. It is the blank on the chart, not blank in the sense of unexplored. Blank in the sense of deliberately, formally, absolutely unmarked. No stellar data, no navigational beacons, no approach vectors. No survey history. Not even the abbreviated survey notations that appear on the charts of every other restricted region in conclave space, indicating at minimum what kind of restriction applies and in what year it was last reviewed. Sector Veth Null has none of that. It is simply absent, an excision from the chart where a chart entry should be, surrounded by the entries of neighboring sectors that approach it on three sides and stop, their boundary coordinates terminating cleanly at the sector's edge, as though the cartographers who drew them were following a rule they had been taught and did not question. The charts in that region carry only a single notation, in the standard navigational warning script, which reads, Restricted Conclave Permanent Prohibition, no entry, no EXCPTONS. And then beneath that, in smaller script that most people notice but few people ask about, see Archive File CCD SX 12000014 Foundational Authority. I had been a historian in this division for 31 years. I had known for 31 years that Sector Veth Null existed, that it was permanently restricted, and that the restriction traced back to an archive file. I had never, until that morning, opened the file. I do not think this reflects poorly on me or on my colleagues. There are thousands of restricted sectors in conclave space, each with its own foundational record, and the work of the division is not to second-guess the restrictions, but to maintain the records that authorize them. Most of the foundational records are dull: old wars, contamination events, collapsed stars, extinct civilizations whose remnants are preserved under scientific access-only protocols. We know the file numbers the way we know door codes, useful to know, never particularly interesting to look behind. I opened the door, past the deposit receipt, past Velkorath's cartographic note from 400 years ago. The file's first substantive layer was a single document. The Orath language in which it was written had been partially decoded. The division held a translation engine calibrated against known Orath texts that could render roughly 60 to 70% of any given Orath document into modern conclave standard, with the remaining portions rendered as notation brackets indicating semantic uncertainty. The document was long approximately 40,000 words in the original, which the translation engine rendered as a 31,000-word conclave standard text with approximately 9,000 words worth of uncertainty brackets. I have read it 3 times in full. I will summarize what I understood from it, because I believe the summary is important, and because I believe I may be the only person currently alive who has read it with enough attention to understand what it was saying. The document was, in its opening sections, what I had expected from the deposit receipt, a prohibition notice. It described Sector Veth Null in formal Orath legal language as a permanently restricted zone, forbidden to all Covenant member species and all species in treaty relationship with the Covenant. The restriction was, it stated, not new. It was a formal codification of a prohibition that had existed in practice for approximately 300,000 years before the document was filed. A prohibition maintained by informal consensus among the Orath's predecessor alliance structures, which the Covenant was formalizing and depositing with the then-nascent conclave in order to ensure continuity. The prohibition was, the document stated, non-negotiable and non-revisable. The filing was not an invitation to discuss, review, or appeal. It was a notification, and the Orath expected the conclave to honor it in perpetuity. This was familiar language. The Orath filed 4 of their 7 archive documents in similar terms, declarative, cold, expecting compliance without explanation. They were not, from everything scholars had reconstructed, a species that believed the universe owed them a rationale. But the prohibition document did not stop with the declaration. It continued. The middle sections, approximately 18,000 words, of which roughly 12,000 had been translated with reasonable confidence and 6,000 remained in uncertainty brackets, were something I had not expected. They were a record, not a legal instrument, not a prohibition notice. A record, structured in the Orath's characteristic historical format, of 3 separate events that the Covenant had documented over the course of its 300,000-year informal prohibition, offered as what the document called, in the translation engine's best rendering, foundational evidence for the restriction's permanent and non-revisable nature. I will describe each event as I read it, in the order the document presented them. The first event was the oldest, dating from approximately 1,200,000 years before the document's filing, which placed it at roughly 2,100,000 years before the present. The Orath called it, in their own language, something the translation engine rendered as the first withdrawal. At that time, the Orath Reach had not yet become the Orath Covenant. What existed was an earlier Orath political structure that the document called the Orath Reach, which was apparently the dominant civilization in a large portion of the galaxy, now corresponding to the inner conclave territories. The Orath Reach had charted extensively and had encountered dozens of other sapient civilizations in various stages of development. They were, by the document's account, a confident and expansionist civilization, not aggressive in the martial sense, but possessed of the particular certainty of a species that has been the largest and most sophisticated thing in their portion of the galaxy for long enough that the notion of encountering something older, something larger, something that had been there before them, had become functionally unthinkable. In the region now designated Sector Vethnal, the Reach's cartographers had flagged an anomaly, a zone unusually dense with what they called, in the translation engine's best rendering, deep signs, a Orath technical term for evidence of civilization that had been accumulating for a very long time, structures of considerable age, energy signatures that did not match any natural phenomenon in the Reach's database. A pattern across multiple star systems in the region, of orbital bodies whose arrangements were too regular to be coincidental, as though something had been tidying the system's furniture over a period of time long enough to make the original arrangement unrecoverable. The Reach established a series of observation posts at the outer edge of the region, not military installations, not settlements but scientific observation posts. The document was careful to note this. The Reach understood that they were approaching something old, possibly something sapient, and they were not foolish enough to arrive with weapons. They were, by the Orath's own account, cautious. They had seen, over the course of their civilization's long history, what happened to species that moved incautiously into unknown territory. They understood the principle. What they did not understand, what nothing in their experience had prepared them to understand, was the particular form that caution would need to take here. They sent 3 ships into the region, survey vessels, peaceful in the Orath sense of that word, which the translation engine rendered with an uncertainty bracket, but which the context suggested meant something like, not armed for conquest, though certainly capable of defense, staffed with the Reach's best cartographers and xenobiologists and diplomats, carrying the standard suite of first contact protocols, greetings in multiple formats, mathematical sequences, a demonstration of awareness that they were approaching something they did not yet understand. None of the 3 ships returned. The Reach waited. They were cautious still. They did not immediately send more ships in. They waited for the standard period of lost contact protocol, 40 days, and then sent a 4th ship, a fast courier, to the outer edge of the region. Not inside, just to the edge. The courier was instructed to observe and report from the boundary without crossing it, to determine whether there was any evidence of what had happened to the 3 survey vessels, and to attempt communication from the boundary position. The fast courier reported that the region appeared quiet. No evidence of the 3 missing ships, no distress signals, no debris field where debris would be expected if the ships had been destroyed. It observed, from the outer edge, what it described as a single structure of considerable size at the approximate center of the region, far larger than anything in the Reach's database of known civilizations could account for, its dimensions described in terms that the translation engine flagged as uncertain, but which suggested something comparable in scale to a small moon, and then reported that it was receiving a transmission. The transmission had been decoded. The Reach had decoded it. What the Reach decoded was not a greeting. It was not a warning. It was the coordinates of the 3 observation posts that the first 3 ships had been heading for when they crossed the boundary. All 3 sets of coordinates, correct in every detail, matching the Reach's own navigational records exactly. The 3 ships had been heading for those specific posts. The thing in the center of the region had returned the post's coordinates. Nothing else. The fast courier's commanding officer asked the Reach for instructions. The Reach instructed the courier to reply, asking for the return of its 3 missing colleagues. The region went quiet. The fast courier waited at the outer edge for 11 standard days. On the 12th day, it received a second transmission. The translation engine rendered the Orath's account of this transmission with moderate confidence. The second transmission did not contain the missing ships. It did not address the request for their return. It contained instead a single statement, in the Orath Reach's own language, in a register the document described as archaic, older than the Reach's current form of the language, closer to forms used several 100,000 years earlier, as though whoever or whatever was sending it had learned the Reach's language from their own much older records and had not yet been updated on how the language had since evolved. The statement, as translated, read, "We know how long you have been here. Go home." The Orath Reach withdrew from the region and did not return. I read the account of the first withdrawal twice before I moved on. What held my attention was not the disappearance of the 3 ships. Disappearances happen in the deep survey record for any number of reasons, but the transmission, the statement, "We know how long you have been here," not "You are not welcome here," not "This region is claimed," not "Withdraw or face consequences," which is the language that every recorded first contact negotiation, across hundreds of thousands of years of documented galactic history, has produced when a territorial species wished to make its position clear to an encroaching one. We know how long you have been here, as though the length of time mattered. As though the Reach's presence in the galaxy, not just in this region, but in the galaxy, the full span of their civilization's history, was something that had been noted and remembered and filed somewhere for longer than the Reach had been keeping their own records. Go home. Not go away. Go home. The distinction lodged in me and stayed lodged. A species that tells you to go away is telling you this region is theirs. A voice that tells you to go home is telling you it knows you have one, and that the appropriate place for you is in it, and that you are very far from where you should be. The second event in the document was dated approximately 400,000 years before the document's filing, which placed it at roughly 1,300,000 years before the present. By this point, the Orath Reach had become the Orath Covenant, and the Covenant's prohibition on Sector Vethnal had been formalized in its predecessor structures for 800,000 years. The second event was filed in the document not as a violation. No Covenant species had entered the region, but as what the document called an adjacency incident. A Covenant fleet, conducting legitimate mapping operations approximately 200 light-years from the sector's boundary, detected a signal of unknown origin transiting through the space they were charting. The signal was not directed at the fleet. It appeared to be in transit, moving, the Covenant's instruments suggested, from a point inside Sector Vethnal toward a point at a considerable distance, in a direction that the Covenant's cartography of that period would have described as outward from the galactic center, into the deep void regions that even the Covenant had not charted. The signal was not in any language the Covenant had on record. And yet the signal was not, the Covenant's analysts quickly determined, a natural phenomenon. Natural phenomena do not produce what they produced when the signal was analyzed. A structured, intentional arrangement of information, 144 distinct informational units in an architecture that bore, at its deepest structural level, an organizational resemblance to the way the Orath Covenant had been keeping its own administrative records for approximately 300,000 years, which meant that whatever was transmitting the signal had either developed, independently and in a parallel fashion, an organizational structure nearly identical to the one, the covenant used, possible, in theory, since underlying logical structures sometimes converge across independent intelligences, though the covenant's analysts found this improbable. Or it had been observing how the covenant kept its records for approximately 300,000 years and had incorporated that structure into its own communications, which implied observation. Sustained, detailed, ongoing observation of the covenant's internal administrative practices, conducted from inside a prohibited sector that the covenant's instruments could not penetrate, for a period of time that spanned the living memory of everyone currently alive in the covenant, and stretched back to the early centuries of the covenant's existence as a political entity. There was a third possibility which the document noted without elaborating on, that the covenant had not developed its administrative record structure independently at all, but had derived it from an earlier source, possibly one that predated the covenant, possibly one it was not aware it had borrowed from. The document did not pursue this possibility. The covenant's analysts, apparently, did not want to pursue it. I found this understandable. The fleet commander who detected the transit signal chose to follow the correct protocol, which was to log it, report it to the covenant's central administration, and submit a copy to the prohibition record. He did not attempt to intercept the signal or alter his mapping course to track its origin. He was, by the document's account, a careful officer who had served in the Covenant Survey Corps for 40 years, and he understood what sector the signal appeared to originate from, and he completed his mapping mandate and went home. The Covenant's analysts spent 70 standard years studying the signal before concluding that they could not decode it and that they did not understand its destination. 70 years, a number that I found, on reflection, oddly reassuring. Not because the failure to decode it was reassuring, but because the Covenant had tried for 70 years before admitting they could not, and because that thoroughness was very much in keeping with what I knew of the Orath. They were not the kind of civilization that gave up quickly. They were the kind that documented the failure carefully, noted the specific points at which their understanding ran out, and filed the record so that whoever came next would know exactly how far and no further the effort had reached. The document noted, with a flatness that I found, across the translation engine's uncertainty brackets, and across the vast distance of 1,000,000 years, somehow deeply unsettling, that the Covenant had filed this incident under the prohibition record rather than under the scientific survey record, because the Covenant believed the signal originated inside Sector Vethnal, and because the Covenant believed the signal was not the first such transit they had missed. It was, the document stated, simply the first one they had detected. In 70 years of analysis, the Covenant's instruments had identified, by examining archival scan data retroactively, 4 other possible transit events in the 200,000 years before the one the fleet had logged, fainter, older, visible only in retrospect with the enhanced analytical techniques the Covenant had developed during the 70-year study. 4 other transits from the same apparent origin in the same apparent direction. None of them had been noticed at the time. The document did not speculate about how many had not been noticed even in retrospect. The third event was the one that the document had been building toward, and I understood that as I read it. The first 2 events were context. The third was the reason the prohibition was being filed with the conclave rather than simply maintained in silence, as it had been for 300,000 years before. The third event had occurred approximately 1,200 years before the document's filing date, which placed it at roughly 913,000 years before the present. A non-covenant species, the document referred to them as the Verath, a name I recognized from other Orath records as a civilization that had been contemporaneous with the early covenant, had maintained trade and diplomatic relations with it for several 100,000 years, and had eventually declined and disappeared from the record, leaving only sparse remnants in the archaeological holdings of 3 conclave archive branches, had entered Sector Vethnal. They had not done so by accident. The document was clear on this. The Verath had known about the Orath prohibition for as long as they had known the Orath. They had honored it, in the way that the smaller partners of a large and ancient alliance honor the customs of the larger partner, not always from conviction, but from respect and from a practical appreciation of which party in the relationship had more experience and more authority on questions of what to approach and what to leave alone. For several 100,000 years, they had honored it. And then, after all that time, they had changed their mind. Their reasons, as the document characterized them, drawing on covenant diplomatic records and communications with the Verath leadership in the centuries before the crossing, which the covenant had maintained in careful detail because the covenant always maintained careful detail, were not malicious. They were philosophical. The Verath had come to believe, after long study and extensive internal debate, that the prohibition rested on a misunderstanding. Their argument, as the covenant's diplomatic record captured it, was that what the Orath had encountered in the first withdrawal was not a civilization, but a natural phenomenon of unusual complexity, a region of space with atypical physical properties that produced, under certain conditions, signals that mimicked the structure of intentional communication without actually being intentional. The Reach's interpretation of those signals as conscious address, "We know how long you have been here. Go home," was, the Verath argued, an example of the universal sapient tendency to see mind in what is merely vast and strange and old. The 3 missing ships had been lost to the region's physical anomalies, not taken by an intelligence. The observation post coordinates in the first transmission were a coincidence produced by the same anomalous properties. The archaic language address was apophenia, pattern-seeking applied to noise. The Verath, in short, believed the Orath had been frightened by an empty room. Their argument was careful and detailed, and as I read it across the translation engine's rendering of the Covenant's diplomatic records, not obviously foolish. I have read a great deal of bad reasoning in 31 years in this division, and what the Verath produced was not bad reasoning. It was reasoning that had simply, at its foundation, made an assumption about the range of what was possible in the universe, and had applied the standard logical tools of a sophisticated civilization to the evidence, and had reached a conclusion that the evidence, viewed from within that assumption, could support. Their error was not in the reasoning. Their error was in the assumption. But they did not know what they did not know, and they were not, by the Covenant's account, arrogant. They were convinced. There is a difference, and I think it matters. They sent a fleet of 22 vessels into Sector Vethnal. The Orath Covenant monitored the crossing from the boundary. All 22 vessels cleared the boundary and were tracked by Covenant instruments at intervals for approximately 18 days. On the 19th day, 7 of the 22 vessels returned. The Covenant dispatched a diplomatic vessel to meet the survivors. The diplomatic record of that meeting occupied the document's third event section entirely, and I will render the relevant portions as the translation engine gave them to me, with the understanding that some of this is uncertain, and that the Orath's account was written from outside the meeting, and that what the 7 surviving Verath vessels could communicate was constrained by what the Verath who had returned were able to say. The 7 survivors were all intact physically, no damage to the vessels, no injuries to the crews. They were, by the Covenant's diplomatic record, not injured and not frightened, at least not in the way that the word frightened maps onto the Verath physiological response. They were something that the document described in translation as arrested, still. Responsive in the narrow sense of being able to answer direct questions, but doing so in a register that the Covenant's diplomats, who had worked with the Verath for centuries and knew their range of expression well, did not recognize as normal Verath communication. Something had changed in the register of how they spoke, not in what they said, in how they said it. As though the mechanism of communication, the intention to convey, the reach toward the listener, the ordinary social architecture of speech, had been, not broken, but recalibrated, set to a different scale, as though they were now accustomed to addressing something much older and much larger, and were finding it difficult to recalibrate back down. The Covenant asked what had happened to the other 15 vessels. The 7 survivors said they did not know. They had been separated from the other 15 on the 3rd day inside the sector. They had not seen them again. They were, the document noted, not distressed when they said this. They said it in the same arrested, recalibrated register as everything else. They said it the way you state a fact that you have already finished processing, a fact that you have accepted, a fact that fits into a framework you now hold, and that did not disturb the framework when it settled into place. The Covenant asked what they had found inside the sector. The 7 survivors described in the document's account a region of space that appeared entirely ordinary in its stellar composition. Stars, systems, the usual distribution of gas and dust and orbital bodies, with one exception. At the approximate center of the region, at coordinates that corresponded, the document noted, with the position of the large structure the Reach's fast courier had reported 2 million years earlier, there was something that the Verath could describe only in terms of what it was not. It was not a planet. It was not a star. It was not a structure in the way that a structure is an object, a thing made of material that occupies a specific volume of space and has edges and a surface and a history of construction. It was, in the translation engine's best rendering of the surviving Verath testimony, something like a place where the question of whether anything was there had been answered in a way that did not use the expected vocabulary of yes or no, where yes or no was not the right grammar for the answer. I read that sentence 4 times. I am still not certain I understand it. I think I am not supposed to understand it from outside. I think the 7 survivors understood it only because they had been inside the sector, in proximity to whatever was at the center, and that the understanding they brought back was not a transferable kind of understanding. It was the kind that you can gesture toward but not hand over. The kind that sits in you and shapes how you speak and how you are still, and cannot be extracted and passed to someone who has not been where you have been. The Covenant asked whether the survivors had made contact with whatever was at the center. The 7 survivors said, "It made contact with us." The Covenant asked, "What did it say?" The 7 survivors gave an answer that occupies the final quarter of the 3rd event section, and which I will quote in the translation engine's full rendering, uncertainty brackets and all, because I do not trust my own paraphrase. It said semantic bracket, the thing that was there, the presence, the inhabitant, uncertain, knew the Orath had sent the notice. It said it had semantic bracket, allowed, permitted, not prevented, uncertain, the filing. It said the filing was semantic bracket, accurate / correct / complete, uncertain. It said the 15 missing ships were not semantic bracket, destroyed, ended / negated, uncertain. They were semantic bracket, kept, held, remembered, uncertain. It said the 7 ships were semantic bracket, returned, sent back / released, uncertain, because the 7 crews were the ones who had semantic bracket, understood first, understood, correctly known to stop, uncertain. It said the notice would semantic bracket, be sufficient / hold / remain true, uncertain, for as long as semantic bracket. What lives here, what has always been here, what was here before the first light, uncertain, chose to semantic bracket. Remain patient / stay / continue waiting, uncertain. It said semantic bracket. We have been here, this has always been here, there is no time in which this was not here, uncertain, longer than semantic bracket. The Orath's counting, the Orath's memory, the concept the Orath use for very long times, uncertain, can reach. It said, "Do not send more." I closed the translation engine and sat for a long time in subchamber 12. The Orath, I understood now, had not filed the prohibition with the conclave because they were afraid of what lived in Sector Vethnal in the way you are afraid of an enemy or a rival or a threat you understand and are trying to contain. They had filed it because they had spent 300,000 years coming to terms with what they had encountered in that region, and the coming to terms had produced in them not fear precisely but a clear and steady and very old knowledge. The kind of knowledge that does not shake because it has already been through everything that would shake it and come out the other side, simplified, refined, reduced to its essential proposition. The proposition was, there is something here. It was here before us. It is here after us. It does not need us to acknowledge it, and it does not need us to stay away. But it has, across 2 million years of observation, asked us to stay away. And the Orath, who were not fools and who had been around long enough to develop the particular wisdom that comes from watching many civilizations make the same kind of mistake in different cosmetic variations, had decided to honor the ask. They had filed the document with the conclave as a gift, because that was what they called it. I understood what kind of gift it was, the kind that passes an obligation from one hand to another, the kind that says, we carried this, and now we are setting it down, and now you carry it. The kind that does not ask whether you want the weight. It simply places it in front of you and trusts that you are the right kind of people to pick it up. The document's final section was the prohibition's formal text, legal language, binding declarations, the administrative machinery of a 900,000-year-old civilization ensuring that its successor institutions would hold the line. I read it. It was thorough and precise and cold in the way that the Orath's best legal work was always cold. No sentiment, no explanation beyond what was necessary, no invitation to argue. It named the sector in Orath coordinates. It specified the boundary. It stated the reason for the prohibition in terms that were, at the level of the formal legal instrument, simply proximity hazard, nature of hazard permanently and fundamentally beyond the scope of conventional threat assessment, approach forbidden in all circumstances, no exceptions to be recognized or granted by any subsequent authority. It stated that the conclave was being given this record as a gift, in the Orath sense, which the translation engine rendered with an uncertainty bracket, but which the context, by this point, I felt I understood. And then it ended. 912,000 years ago, the Orath had filed this document with the then nascent conclave, and the conclave had sealed it, and the prohibition had been honored, and Sector Vethnal had sat at the edge of the charts for 900,000 years with its single notation. Restricted, conclave permanent prohibition, no entry, no excptions. I sat in subchamber 12, and I thought about the document I had just read. I thought about what the Verath 7 survivors had said. I thought about the 15 ships that were not destroyed but kept. I thought about the transmission the early Orath Reach had received in their own archaic language 2 million years ago. We know how long you have been here. Go home. I thought about the signal in transit 400,000 years ago, in a format the Covenant had used for 300,000 years, but had not, as far as anyone knew, invented. And I thought about the thing that the translation engine had struggled with at the end of the survivor's account, the semantic bracket around the phrase that read, "There is no time in which this was not here." I pulled up the file's access log and looked at the names of the historians who had opened it before me. There were 11 of them. Vel Korath, 400 years ago, who had translated the coordinate header and never returned. 8 others across the centuries, each of whom had opened the file, and then I checked the division's personnel records as far as they went, subsequently requested reassignment, or retired unexpectedly, or in 2 cases simply stopped appearing in the division's records without a noted reason. And then 2 more recent entries. A historian named Sale Oren, 40 years ago, who had opened the file and within 3 days submitted a request to transfer to a different division entirely, a request that had been approved. And a historian named Verath Ku, 19 years ago. The name caught my eye, though it was almost certainly coincidence, the Verath having been extinct long enough that their name had passed into the conclave's common nomming pools without anyone thinking much about where it came from, who had opened the file, closed it within 6 minutes, and submitted a formal request asking the division director to have the file's access requirements changed to require a committee review rather than individual access approval. The request had been denied. The director at that time had noted in the margin of the denial, current access protocols sufficient, classification level already maximum, no committee procedure required. Vereth Koo had transferred to the division's physical relics subdepartment, and according to the personnel records, spent the remainder of her career cataloging pottery shards from dead civilizations on the Outer Rim. I found her final personnel entry: retired, voluntary, after 29 additional years of service, commendation noted for thoroughness. She had done good work. She had found, I suspected, that pottery shards from dead civilizations were very restful company. I understood her. But I was a senior historian, 3rd tier, and my mandate was to review the file, and I had not finished reviewing it. Because the file, I realized as I scrolled through the index for the first time with full attention, had a second layer. Beneath the ORETH document, beneath Velkoreth's cartographic note, beneath the access log, there was a sub-file. It was listed in the index as Addendum Filed Post-Original Deposit Access Restricted Maximum Custodial Field, blank. The addendum's filing date was 12,217 standard years before the present. The ORETH had gone extinct approximately 12,000 standard years before the present. I stared at the addendum's filing date for a long time. The arithmetic was straightforward, and I had done it the moment I saw the date, and I did not want to do it again. But I did it again anyway, with the same result. The addendum had been filed approximately 200 years after the ORETH's last known evidence of civilization, after their ruins fell silent. After the 17 worlds they had inhabited stopped producing any signals that the Conclave's instruments could detect. After the Conclave had formally classified the ORETH as extinct and transferred their archive materials to the historical sealed permanent designation. Someone had filed an addendum to the ORETH's prohibition, record 2 centuries after the ORETH no longer existed to file anything. The addendum's metadata, the standard administrative header that the Conclave's archival system attached to all deposits, regardless of the depositing party, listed the filing method as direct deposit physical vault, meaning someone or something had physically placed a document in the archive, not transmitted it, not uploaded it through the standard network access points, placed it. The Conclave's physical vault protocols in that period required a certified deposit official to be present for all direct deposits. The deposit official's name was recorded in the metadata. The name in the metadata was a Conclave official from 12,000 years ago, a records clerk named Veth Oron, whose personnel file I located in the division's deep archive. Veth Oron had worked in the physical vault receiving room for 30 years and had received, according to her personnel record, no unusual notations in her file, no disciplinary actions, no commendations, a perfectly ordinary career. The kind that most people who work in receiving rooms have until the final entry made 11 days after the date of the addendum's filing, which read, voluntarily resigned, effective immediately, reason given, personal. She had been 43 years old at the time. The division's records did not show where she went. I opened the addendum. It was not in the ORETH language. It was not in any language that the translation engine flagged as familiar, which meant it was not in any of the several hundred languages and language fragments in the division's translation database, which covered every documented civilization in the Conclave's 900,000-year recorded history. It should not have been readable. I should have had to flag it as unanalyzed and submit a translation request to the linguistics subdepartment, and wait the standard 18 to 24 months for a result. I did not have to do that, because the addendum was also in Conclave standard. Both languages ran in parallel columns, left and right, line by line, the unknown language on the left and Conclave standard on the right. Someone's something had written its own translation. The conclave standard text was correct in grammar, accurate in syntax, and composed in a register that I recognized, with a historian's ear for such things, as formal ancient. The form of conclave standard used approximately 12,000 years ago, somewhat archaic by modern standards, but fully legible, clear enough that I could read it without any assistance at all. The addendum was short. I will reproduce it here in its entirety, because it is the kind of thing that should exist somewhere outside the official record, and because I know, that no one else is going to set it down. To the archive that holds this record, and to whoever reads what is kept here. The Orath honored the boundary for a long time. We remember all of them. They were thorough, and they were careful, and they did what was asked of them. You will not see them again, but they are not gone in the way you mean when you say gone. They chose to remain at the end which was not the end. We do not expect you to understand this. We are aware that you are maintaining the boundary. We are aware of how long you have been maintaining it. We know your name, and the names of every civilization that has sat at this boundary and looked across it and decided not to cross. We know the ones who crossed anyway. The ones who crossed and came back are the ones you call survivors. The ones who crossed and did not come back are not gone either. We want you to understand this, although we expect that you will not. We are filing this addendum because the Orath asked us to, before they stopped being what they were and became what they are now. We are filing it because we want you to know that the boundary will not be enforced on you. You are not held here. The record says do not enter, and we are not asking you to pretend the record says something it does not. We are telling you that the record is accurate and that you have honored it well and that we have noticed. We are still here. We have always been here. We were here before the first light that your instruments can still detect, and we will be here after the last one fails. We do not require anything from you. We are asking, simply and without threat, that you do not send more. The record stands. The boundary stands. We are grateful for the Orath's diligence and for yours. We know your name. That was all. I sat in subchamber 12 for a very long time after I finished reading. I am a historian. I have spent 31 years in the business of holding records, of understanding what records mean, of standing at the junction between what happened and what is known to have happened. I am not, as a professional matter, given to imprecision. I have spent my career resisting the interpreter's temptation to reach past what the evidence actually says toward what would be satisfying to believe. I know what evidence is. I know the difference between evidence and implication. I know the difference between implication and inference. And I know the difference between inference and the kind of thing you feel in the marrow of a slow morning, in a very old building, when you have just read something that should not exist. I know these things. I will tell you what I concluded. The addendum was not Orath. The Orath were dead before it was filed, and in any case it was not in their language. It was not filed by any conclave species. The filing clerk, Veth Oron, had received it in a physical vault and left her job 11 days later, and I would be willing to give a great deal to know what she saw in that vault on the morning of the deposit, but I expect that question has no accessible answer. The addendum was composed in a language that the division's full translation database, containing records of hundreds of civilizations, millions of years of documented linguistic history, did not recognize, and it had translated itself into a form of conclave standard from 12,000 years ago, as though it had known that a reader in a particular administrative tradition would eventually sit down with it and would need it in that form. We know your name. Not the conclave's name, not the archive's name. My name. I understood that when I read it. I do not mean that I believe on evidence that the addendum was addressed to me specifically as an individual. I mean that I read those 4 words and understood, with a certainty that I cannot justify to a review committee and would not try to justify, that they were not a general statement of philosophical reach, not a gesture toward the idea that a sufficiently vast and old intelligence might know many things. They were a statement of specific, precise, detailed knowledge, delivered with the complete absence of emphasis that marks a statement so obviously true that emphasizing it would be a kind of condescension. The kind of knowledge that does not need to explain how it was obtained. The kind that announces itself simply, the way you tell someone that the weather is cold. We know your name. I reviewed the physical vault records from 12,000 years ago to confirm that the deposit receipt existed and was genuine. It was. I confirmed Veth Oron's service record and her resignation. Genuine. I ran the standard linguistic analysis protocol on the unknown language column of the addendum and received the result I had expected. No matches in the database, no partial matches, no structural analogs. The language was not a variant or a descendant of anything the division had ever cataloged. I confirmed that the conclave standard column was written in a form consistent with the standard in use 12,000 years ago by running it against dated texts from that period. It matched. Clean match. The addendum had been written by something that understood the archive's history, the conclave's linguistic evolution, and the precise form in which its message would need to be written to be legible to a conclave reader 12,000 years later, which implies it knew that a conclave reader would be reading it 12,000 years later, which implies it knew the conclave would still exist, in something like its current form, with something like its current archive, with a historian in subchamber 12 working through the legacy sealed records in numerical sequence, eventually reaching the lowest number, eventually opening the file. I did not look for further evidence after that. I did not think further evidence would be productive. What I did next, I reviewed my mandate documentation. My mandate was to issue reclassification recommendations. For CCD SX 12000001, the appropriate recommendation under the standard rubric was clearly archive permanent. Too old, too foundationally embedded, too significant to the standing policy governing sector Vethnol to be reclassified or released. That was the straightforward professional determination, and I noted it. But the mandate also permitted, in cases where the reviewing historian determined that the record's access protocols were insufficient for its content, the submission of an enhanced restriction request. Enhanced restriction meant a reclassification from maximum access with individual approval to maximum access with committee review. Exactly what Vereth Ku had requested 19 years ago and been denied. I did not file an enhanced restriction request, not because Vereth Ku had been wrong. She had been right. The access protocols were insufficient. Any individual historian sitting alone in subchamber 12 with a standard terminal and a morning to spare could do exactly what I had done. That should not be possible. That should require more than one person's curiosity and one automated access approval. I did not file the enhanced restriction request because I did not trust the current director to honor it, and because I did not trust a committee review process to arrive at an outcome better than what I could do myself, alone, in the time I had. I filed in the standard reclassification form a recommendation of archive permanent with full access revocation, not enhanced restriction, not committee review required, full revocation. The recommendation, under division procedure, would be reviewed by the director, and if approved, would result in the file being physically moved to the sealed vault in subchamber 0, the oldest and deepest level of the archive, access to which required not a committee but a formal conclave council resolution, and removed from the general inventory database entirely. It would still exist. It would still be foundational authority for the sector Vethnol restriction. But no individual historian, browsing through legacy sealed records on a routine mandate, would ever again be able to call it up with a standard access request and sit alone with it for a morning in subchamber 12. That recommendation is in the system now. The director has not yet approved or denied it. The file remains in the general inventory database at maximum access with individual approval. I am not going back to subchamber 12. There is one more thing I am noting here. because it is the kind of thing that should exist in a record somewhere, and because I will not be putting it in the official record, and because I have been a historian for 31 years, and I find it very difficult to be in possession of a fact and not write it down. After I filed the reclassification recommendation and logged out of the terminal, I gathered my materials and prepared to leave. The lights in subchamber 12 are motion sensitive. They stay at working level while you are moving and dim when you are still. I had been still for some time while I worked, and then I had moved to gather my things, and the lights brightened accordingly. As they brightened, I noticed something on the terminal screen that I had not noticed before. The session had logged out automatically, as it always does after 15 minutes of inactivity. The screen showed the standard logged out display, the division's administrative header, the access prompt, the date and time. Below the time, in a small secondary display field that I had never seen activated in 31 years of using division terminals, and that I would later confirm with a technical officer was not a standard feature of any terminal in the division's current system architecture, there was a line of text in conclave standard, modern conclave standard, not archaic, current, as though it had been written this morning for a reader sitting in a chair in subchamber 12 on this particular day. It read, "Archive received. We know you will keep it well." The field was empty when I looked at it a second time. The technical officer found no record of any display output in the terminal's logs for that period. There was nothing in the logs at all for the last 3 minutes of my session, not the reclassification recommendation I had filed, not the log-out event, not the timestamp. 3 minutes of the terminal's history simply absent. The technical officer noted a possible display glitch in the maintenance log and closed the ticket. I agreed it was probably a display glitch. I said this in the flat and entirely believable tone of a historian who has spent 31 years learning to hold the things that she carries without letting them show in her voice. That was 14 days ago. The prohibition on sector Vethnol will stand. It will stand because the Orath filed it 912,000 years ago and deposited it with the conclave, and because the conclave has honored it ever since, and because every civilization that has ever sent ships into that sector has sent fewer back than it sent in. It will stand because the navigational charts carry their single notation and their single reference to an archive file that most historians spend their careers never opening. It will also stand for a reason that has nothing to do with conclave prohibitions and everything to do with the thing in the addendum's last line, the thing that was here before the first light. The thing that has noticed, across 900,000 years of the conclave's diligence, that the boundary has been held. The thing that kept the Verath's 15 ships and sent the other 7 home, because those 7 were the ones who had understood first. The thing that waited 200 years after the Orath went extinct to place a document in a physical vault, addressed to whoever would read it 12,000 years later, in the language that reader would need, and then left the records clerk to her 11 days of carrying whatever she had carried from that morning. The thing that knows my name. I do not know what it is. I do not know whether the humans, the species that lives in the forbidden zone, the species the conclave has charted around and marked restricted on every navigational document for as long as the conclave has existed, know what shares that sector with them, or what walked there before them, or what they are custodians of without perhaps knowing they are custodians. I do not know whether the humans are the reason the prohibition exists, or whether they are the most recent and most visible sign of a reason that predates them by an inconceivable margin. I do not know what the addendum meant when it said the Orath had stopped being what they were and became what they are now, or what the 7 Verath survivors had understood when they looked at what was at the center of the sector, and found that yes and no were not the right grammar for the answer. I know only what the record says. The record says, do not send more. I am a historian. I have spent 31 years keeping records, not sending ships. I will keep the record in the way the Orath kept it for 300,000 years, and the way the conclave has kept it for 900,000 more. Quietly, without pushing. without appealing if the director denies my recommendation, because I have done what I can do and the rest is outside my authority, and I have learned over 31 years to work within my authority and accept the limits of what one historian in one subchamber can accomplish. I will not speak of this. The recommendation is filed. The document exists. The addendum exists. The terminal log has a 3-minute gap that the maintenance ticket called a display glitch, and that I am not going to call anything else in any official record for the remainder of my career. The sector has no name on the chart that matters. The chart that matters is the one the Orath filed, 912,000 years ago, in the formal language of a civilization that understood what it was adjacent to, and chose to spend the rest of its existence honoring the choice. The chart that was confirmed, 12,000 years after the Orath were gone, in a physical vault on a morning that a records clerk remembered for 11 days before she decided she was done remembering it. The last record filed on that sector said, "Do not send more." I will not.